Now listen up.
Coming to you from a toddler's playroom in the Lone Star State. Welcome to Health, Wealth, and a Taste of History, where we ramble and you listen. Bringing you weird history, food science, and the facts you didn't know you needed. Here are your hosts, Bob and Tom.
Hey historians, welcome back to another episode with Bob and Tom. When you think about Halloween, what comes to mind? Candy? Cavities? Your kids hyped up on so much sugar that there's no way they're making their bedtime?
Well, according to the Atlantic.com, Americans are going to spend an estimated $2 billion on candy during the Halloween season this year. And just another little cool fact is that the California Milk Processors Board states that on average, a jack-o'-lantern bucket, those little orange buckets that look like a pumpkin, carries about 250 pieces of candy. That amounts to around 9,000 calories and about 3 pounds of sugar.
That's a lot of sugar. That's about 4.5 days of calories, too, for an active adult.
Yeah, it's crazy. So Halloween starts off as a festival in the Celtic tradition, and it's called the Festival of Samhain. And it celebrates the New Year and the fall harvest. So how did we start celebrating a Celtic fall harvest? Well, what we know today is trick-or-treating actually started off in England and Ireland, and it was a tradition that was called going souling, which meant that the children in the early 20th century would celebrate the Festival of Samhain by knocking on their neighbor's door and offering to pay for the souls of their deceased relatives in exchange for gifts. Except they wouldn't be handing candy back then because this was a different time period. Candies and chocolates weren't really something that was available back then, so the children would be given food, coins, ale, and other small items for their prayers. And this tradition made its way to America from European immigrants who came over in the early 1900s. So trick-or-treating really started to become popular in the United States in the 1940s when small towns wanted to get to know their neighbors because you had World War II going on and just after World War II. So at first it was very common that the children would receive things like homemade cakes, cookies, fruit muffins, and candied apples. So by the time the 1960s come along, the parents start to become more concerned that their neighbors are giving their kids treats that could be harmful to their children. By the 1970s, you see that there's more dual income families. So in reality, who had the time to stay home and bake tons of Halloween treats? Well, and really nobody. We also start to see a real rise in obesity around that time, but we'll save all that for another episode.
Yeah, and around this time, the candy makers, they started to see this as a really good opportunity to capture the market with their product. But before we go too far, let's define candy for those that are wondering. Candy, which is also called sweets in British English or lollies in Australian or New Zealand English, is a confection that features sugar as a principal ingredient. The category, called sugar confectionery, encompasses any sweet confection, including chocolate, chewing gum, and sugar candy. Vegetables, fruits, or nuts, which can be glazed and coated with sugar, are also said to be candy. Now, these candy makers, they started advertising campaigns to promote safe, prepackaged candy. But it wasn't only the candy companies. And candies weren't always safe. In the late 1800s, as the path from producer to market became increasingly complicated, many foods were affected by adulteration and the addition of additives, which range from relatively harmless ingredients such as cheap cornstarch and corn syrup to poisonous ones.
Wow.
Some manufacturers produced bright colors in candy by the addition of a lot of hazardous stuff, which at the time there was no legal regulation for. So, for example, to produce a green color, they would add chromium oxide and copper acetate. For red, they would add stuff like lead oxide and mercury sulfide. For yellow, you're looking at lead chromate. And white, they would add chalk and arsenic trioxide.
So we don't know how fortunate that we've got it in this day and age that there are government agencies out there to protect us from these types of things. It was really bad with the meats back in those days as well. So let's get back to the advertising. It was also gum Kool-Aid, and even many of the cereal companies such as Post and Kellogg that were trying to advertise their products to the little ghosts and goblins that we had running around. The candy industry also led to a lot of innovation. You take this company called Necco Company, who produces the Necco wafers. They're these little tiny wafers that look and taste like chalk, but they're also the company that make the little candy hearts for Valentine's. And it was one of the first food production companies of its kind to completely go automated. That's without any kind of human touch. Just a little random thing for y'all.
All right, so who were some of these big candy manufacturers that were pushing their products to our grandparents and great-grandparents?
Well, let's get started off with Milton Hershey, the American chocolatier, businessman, and philanthropist who literally built an entire town called Hershey, Pennsylvania for his employees and the chocolate company. He also started a boarding school that originally was for male orphans, and today it accommodates 2,000 students with over $12 billion in assets. And that's making Milton Hershey School one of the wealthiest schools in the world. Milton Hershey was born September 13th, 1857 in Derry Township, Pennsylvania. His family were part of a Mennonite community. The early years of Henry and Fanny, that was Hershey's parents, the marriage was filled with frequent moves as Henry followed one failed dream after another, and each move carried them further down poverty in rough circumstances. There's another story that I'd heard about where in the early parts of the Civil War, when the South was coming up towards Gettysburg, Hershey's actually had about 17 cents and went outside and buried that in the yard because he was afraid that they were going to take it from him. Yeah. So Milton was expected to work on the family farm and only had a fourth grade education. In 1871, he began an apprenticeship at a local printer, but found that work incredibly boring and was actually fired not long after that. Now, his aunt and his mother wanted him to learn how to make candy, so she arranged for him to go and work in an apprenticeship. He was about 14 years old with a confectioner named Joseph Royer in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And he spends the next 4 years learning how to create confectionaries, and in 1876 moved to Philly to start a confectionery company. Over the years, he traveled from city to city, mastering his craft, and in 1883, he returned to Lancaster and started the Lancaster Caramel Company. This company became so successful that he was actually able to sell it for $1 million, which was an incredible amount of money back in those days. He used that money to start the Hershey Chocolate Company and build this gigantic company out in the middle of dairy farm country in Pennsylvania, where there's lots of fresh water, and his family was able to obtain the supplies that he needed to produce the milk chocolate, which at the time was still very much a luxury. He had big dreams to supply chocolate to the average American consumer. So in 1900, he produced his first milk chocolate bar, and in 1905, his chocolate manufacturing company, which was the largest in the world at that time, was completed. In 1907, the famous Hershey Kisses was introduced, and it said that his mother could be found wrapping these little Hershey's chocolates by hand. It's pretty crazy. You think that all that stuff was done by hand back in that time. So Milton builds this entire town called Hershey, Pennsylvania, around his manufacturing plant. That includes homes, a bank, a library, and eventually the park called Hershey Park, which I took my kids to when they were little, at least twice when we were up in New Jersey. Just absolutely gorgeous area of Pennsylvania, and the park was, even though it was older at that time, was still a heck of a lot of fun and a cool place, and actually incorporates a zoo with it as well.
Mm-hmm. And fun fact, Milton Hershey and his wife Kitty, they actually had tickets to be on the Titanic for the maiden voyage, the one that sank. But they actually had to cancel last minute due to work, so they kind of got lucky on that one.
Yeah, it's not so much fun, but it's terrible, but they were lucky.
And today, Hershey is worth about $30.3 billion.
That's incredible. Some countries don't have that GDP.
So what about some of the other major chocolate manufacturers, like Mars? While Hershey built his company to be a better way of life for his employees, Mars, on the other hand, was all about the profit. Frank Mars was born in 1883 and was taught how to make candy by his mother. He actually contracted polio at a young age and was unable to walk without a cane for the rest of his life. He tried selling candies, but kept failing. He kept trying and trying and trying. And eventually he was able to make a profit in Minnesota with his second wife, Ethel, which, strangely enough, both of his wives were actually named Ethel. I guess he kind of had a type. His son, Forrest, who was his first Ethel wife, was also obsessed with making money since he grew up in such poverty. Forrest was the true driving force behind making the company so successful. Mars originally approached a guy named William Murray, who at the time was the first president of the Hershey Company, looking for a steady supply of chocolate for Milky Way, his new candy bar. So Hershey was the original supplier of chocolate to the Mars Company. At the time, Mars was such a small company that Hershey didn't mind, and Mars ended up becoming Hershey's biggest customer. Today, the companies still compete to be at the top of the chocolate market. And in order to compete with the Milky Way, Hershey came up with the Mr. Good bar, and then Mars introduced the Snickers bar and the Three Musketeers. So they started having a little bit of a back and forth. Now, Forrest Mars, he rarely saw his father after his parents divorced when he was a child. And after graduating high school, he attended Berkeley and then transferred to Yale and completed a degree in industrial engineering. He did end up reuniting with his father as an adult, but the two disagreed when Forrest wanted to expand to Europe and Frank did not. After Frank bought out Forrest in 1933, so he bought his son out, he moved to England where he created the Mars bar. During his time in England, Forrest worked briefly for Nestle and then the Tobler Company, which is best known for the Toblerone. In 1934, Forrest bought a British company called Chappell Brothers that specialized in canned meat for dogs. Once he returned back to the States, he started another food business called Food Products Manufacturing. With this new company, he actually established some brands that we're really familiar with nowadays. He started Uncle Ben's Rice and Pedigree. Yeah, the dog food.
Would have never thought that, huh?
And then in 1941, Mars started production on M&Ms, which actually stands for Mars and Murray, the two kind of driving forces behind this being a possibility. Now, Bruce Murray, who was the son of William Murray, the president of Hershey, actually had a 20% stake in the M&M Limited Company. Mars got the idea from soldiers from the Spanish Civil War who were eating a British candy called Smarties. Now, those aren't the Smarties that you're familiar with now. They were a little different, and those had a hardened sugar outer coating that could survive high heat and would actually prevent them from melting. So Mars went out and he got a patent for his own non-melting candy and came up with the slogan, "Melt in your mouth, not your hand." And during World War II, he sold them strictly to the military, and then after the war, that's when he started marketing them to the everyday consumer.
That's got to be one of the most successful marketing slogans ever invented. Now, according to dailymeal.com, it's an article that they had wrote that lists each state's favorite candy. And so now in the home state of Texas that we're in, M&M's actually ranked as the favorite. During World War II, Hershey's and Mars were both producing items for soldiers. Now, while Mars actually approached the military trying to get a contract, the military went out and sought out Hershey, because he was the big guy back then, in 1937, requesting a chocolate bar be made for their rations. And get this, it actually said this. They wanted to get a chocolate bar that was just a little bit better than a boiled potato. And they would call it their energy bar. And they wanted it not tasting so good because they didn't want the soldiers to get hooked on it. Today, Mars is worth $90 billion. That's right, $90 billion. It's insane.
You're listening to Health, Wealth, and a Taste of History with Bob and Tom. We'll be right back.
So where does the popular Reese's peanut butter come into? Well, in 1923, Harry Burnett Reese, a.k.a. H.B. Reese, the founder of Reese's, started the H.B. Reese Candy Company from his basement. And where at? Now just wait for it. Guess. Hershey, Pennsylvania. Yep, you heard that correct. Reese had originally worked at Hershey's dairy farm, and from the start, he used Hershey chocolate in his confections. HB died in 1956, leaving the company to his 6 sons. And in 1963, the brothers agreed to merge with the Hershey Company. In 1969, that's just 6 years after the company's merger, Reese's Peanut Butter Cups became Hershey's top seller. And in 2012, the Peanut Butter Cup was the best-selling candy in the United States with sales over $2.6 billion.
So pretty much everything leads back to Hershey. So now that we know Hershey and Mars are the major American chocolatiers, but let's take a look quick into some of the significant chocolate companies over in Europe as well, because that's important.
So let's look at, another major company that we all know of, Nestle, right? And it's called Nestle Global today. It's one of the largest companies in the world, and actually the largest food company in the world when you look at their revenue. Nestle was formed in 1905 by a merger of two companies, one called the Anglo-Swiss Milk Company, which was a company that two brothers formed in Switzerland called Charles and George Page. Charles was actually the U.S. consul to Switzerland at the time. They come up with this condensed milk company in 1886. Henry Nestle was actually a pharmacist, and what he develops is a baby formula. This is crazy. Baby formula made of cow's milk, flour, and sugar. He called it Farine Lactée, and he developed his company in 1887. Now, these two companies, Anglo-Swiss Milk Company and Nestle, kind of went back and forth till that 1905 merger, being the biggest competitors of one another. They actually developed competing lines of condensed milk, baby food, baby cereals. Now, these two companies developed this competing line, and they become this huge mega company. But where does the chocolate come in? Well, that's in 1888. Daniel Peter began developing milk chocolate, and he needed a way to reduce the amount of moisture that was going into that bar from the milk. And lo and behold, who had the solution to the problem? That was Nestle with his condensed milk. So Nestle merged with Daniel Peter in 1879. So when you get this big merger over the Anglo-Swiss company and Nestle, they've already got a milk chocolate bar in 1905, and then what they do is start to market something called Swiss chocolate. That's what we know about today, right? So Nestle is the largest food company in the world, operating food, water, pet foods, cosmetics, and pharmaceutical divisions. 29 of Nestle's brands, that's 29 of the 200 brands that Nestle owns, have an annual sale of over $1.1 billion. That includes Nespresso, that's coffee, Nescafe, coffee, Kit Kat, Smarties, Nesquik, and Stouffer's. And there's just so many other name brands that you know about today that they actually own. They operate 447 factories in 189 countries. And they employ a little over 339,000 people. And Nestle is also the largest shareholder in, you wouldn't believe this, but the largest shareholder in the largest cosmetic company in the world, L'Oreal. So chocolate company actually owns the major part of L'Oreal, the large cosmetic company. And today, the net worth of Nestle's is somewhere in the area of $304.1 billion. All
right, now let's shift over to another company. So in Alba, Italy, there's a chocolate factory that is armed with guards, 10-foot concrete walls, and large gates. And that's known as the Ferrero plant. So Ferrero is actually the maker of Tic Tac, Mon Cherie, Kinder, and Nutella, and also those crazy little Ferrero chocolate balls.
No, that is just so great. Yeah.
So according to an article on Forbes, here's a quote. Underneath, high-speed cameras scan for imperfections. A tiny flaw in the coating is enough to trigger a puff of air that shoots the offending chocolate off the line. We do everything with seriousness and extreme competence. So that's a quote from Giovanni Ferrero, the firm's 53-year-old chairman, talking about the kind of quality control that they have within their business. Now, Ferrero's namesake owners are worth an estimated $31 billion altogether, 21 of which belongs to Giovanni, who's the 47th richest person in the world. Now, this company was founded in 1946 in Italy by Giovanni's grandfather, Pietro. And according to Forbes again, in 2015, he bought the venerable British chocolatier Thornton's for $170 million. It was Ferrero's first branded acquisition ever. And then the biggest purchase came in March when he acquired Nestle's U.S. candy business for $2.8 billion in cash. Now, so that leads them to own American icons like Butterfinger, Baby Ruth, and several others that are now within this guy Giovanni's domain.
Yeah, so you hear about these big brand names and you're thinking, wow, they're their own little company, but really most of these are owned by somebody else and then they're sold back and forth. According to candyindustry.com, in 2020, the global top 100 candy companies based on sales of confectionaries, that's the stuff they make with sugar, Mars is the top one. It's the first company in the world with an estimated net sales of confectionaries worth about $18 billion. And then Hershey's comes along somewhere around fifth with $7.9 billion. You might as well say $8 billion in sales. And Nestle's is the sixth with close to another $8 billion in sales. Now, that's, like I said, that's just their confectionery. That's not all the other stuff they own because, Nestle's like $300 and something billion annually with everything they own. And Hershey's got other stuff as well. Now, let's go back a few years and talk about where candy originally started. The word candy actually comes from an Arabic word that is pronounced quandi, and that is meaning made of sugar, which actually is kind of interesting because we had this other podcast about sugar, and this word actually goes back a lot farther than that. In an ancient Sanskrit text, there is a script where they're actually talking about different types of sugar products that they had developed around then, and this is like 1500 BC, and one of them is called gur, the word sugar, and another one is called khandi, Khandi. So then you see a few 100 years later that in the Arabic it's called quandi. So if we look back in ancient history, it seems that candy actually originated in India between the 6th and 4th century BCE. Honey was used in ancient Egypt, China, and the Arabs actually would candy their fruits and nuts in order to produce an early form of candy. The Aztecs and the Mayans were the first to drink chocolate by using cocoa beans. And in the early 1500s, the Spanish explorers bring back the cocoa tree from Central America to Europe. Now, prior to the Industrial Revolution in 1760, candy was often considered a form of medicine to calm the digestive system or to help soothe a sore throat. They would add it as an additive to some of the other medicines that taste kind of bitter. And I remember being a kid in the late 60s, early 70s and getting medicine on a sugar cube. Candy would appear on the tables of the mostly wealthy people. And these people had plenty of digestive problems back then because they were eating a lot of salted meats. The food usually wasn't fresh, or their meals definitely weren't well balanced. Bacteria are usually not able to grow on candy due to its high sugar concentration. Because of this high sugar concentration, candy is able to have a longer shelf life than many other foods. Most candy can be stored for months, really even years. And prior to the 20th century, candy was typically sold on carts in the street and not wrapped and completely exposed to all the elements, including bugs and dirt. And from my years of working around the grocery business, I can tell you that a lot of the candy that isn't sold will go in the warehouse, in a cooler someplace, and probably come back out the following year.
All right, so, and because we like to give you all the stats and cool facts, we're going to leave you guys off with some random candy knowledge. So this first bit is from mentalfloss.com. So Mars introduces the Snickers bar in 1930, and it was actually named after a beloved racehorse that had recently passed away at the family farm, the Milky Way in Tennessee. Yes, the family farm was named after their candy. Another fun fact, every day 64 million Tootsie Rolls are made, which means over 44,440 Tootsie Rolls are created every single minute.
That's insane.
Now, Three Musketeers was also originally named that because it featured chocolate, strawberry, and vanilla pieces of candy. Kind of like a Neapolitan, I guess.
Yeah.
But vanilla, strawberry, and sugar were scarce during World War II, so they just decided to focus primarily on chocolate. Another cool bit of information is that the Mars factory in New Jersey produces about 4 million M&Ms a minute.
Million? Wow.
Million per minute. That works out to about 5,760,000,000 M&Ms per day, which comes out to basically 21 with 11 zeros after it per year. Whatever that number
21
is.
to the 12th power or something like that.
2.1 to the 12th power. So 21 with 11 zeros. Now that's a lot of M&Ms. Now, one of the only things we can think of that's produced in higher natural volume is chicken eggs, due to the fact that there's like 24, 25 billion chickens in the world.
Yep, that's a true statement, which is pretty insane.
Even if you assume that a quarter of those at any given time are laying hens, you're still looking at like 6 billion eggs per day. So that barely beats out M&Ms. So that's all we got for you guys on candy. We really hope you enjoyed it, and we wanted to sneak this episode in for Halloween, just so you had some cool talking points with the family, and that's all we got for you guys. So we'll see you next time.
Happy Halloween.
You've been listening to Health, Wealth, and a Taste of History with Bob and Tom.
That was radical!
The #1 audio production for people with nothing better to do.
That was amazing.
For more info, head over to healthwealthandhistory.com. Thanks for listening, and until next time.